The ledger in my hands proves Michael is stealing everything. His security guard just blocked the door. I swing my medical textbook like a weapon, one shot to get my mother out alive. The keycard in my pocket might open the back exit. But the nurse he hired isn't who she says she is. And the academy offer, a one-way ticket out of the country. I have 30 seconds before he realizes I know. The mahogany door clicked shut, sealing Sarah inside a room that smelled of expensive cedar and stale peppermint. Dust motes danced in the thin blade of moonlight cutting across Michael's desk. Her pulse thrummed against her collarbone, a frantic rhythm she ignored while her fingers traced the underside of the heavy oak drawer. She found the hidden catch. A small compartment slid open with a whisper of wood on wood. Inside lay a single cream envelope. Sarah slid the document out, her eyes scanning the dense legal jargon. Her breath hitched. The language didn't protect the firm. It wove a net around her. Paragraph 4 named her as the sole signatory for the offshore transfers Michael had authorized months ago. They hadn't built a partnership. He had constructed a cage. This was the emancipation he had promised. Not a release from his shadow, but a tether that would drag her into the depths of his own financial rot. She was 26, but looking at the forged signatures and the cold, clinical layout of the theft, she felt the same weight she had carried at 14. She shoved the document into her waistband, the paper cold against her skin. Her hand brushed a leather-bound ledger tucked behind a row of encyclopedias. She pulled it free. Unlike the polished digital records in the office, this book bore handwritten scrawls in Michael's jagged script. Names, dates, and figures blurred together, etched with enough pressure to indent the pages. It was a map of her mother's disappearance. Not of her body, but of her life's blood. Every cent of Elizabeth's trust fund was being bled out into accounts Sarah didn't recognize. The numbers didn't have an agenda, but they told a story of systematic execution. A floorboard groaned in the hallway. Sarah froze, clutching the ledger to her chest. The heavy scent of Michael's cologne, a sharp metallic citrus, seemed to seep through the door cracks. She shoved the ledger into her bag and moved toward the window. The latch resisted, biting into her palm before it finally swung wide to let in the biting city air. She didn't check the height. She simply gripped the stone ledge and vanished into the shadows of the fire escape, her heart a hammer against her ribs. The descent was a blur of cold iron and the distant hum of Greenwich traffic. Sarah reached the ground and sprinted toward the detached guest house that had been converted into a high-end infirmary. The air here was different. Sterile, chilled to a shivering 62 degrees, and smelling of industrial bleach. She burst through the door, her breath coming in ragged gasps. Her mother, Elizabeth, lay beneath a thin white sheet, her skin the color of parched parchment. Sarah moved with practiced, frantic precision. She grabbed the heavy black medical bag from the corner, her fingers trembling as she began to pack. She didn't just grab bandages. She snatched the oxygen canisters, the specialized monitors, and the vials of clear liquid that Michael insisted were restorative. Every clink of glass against glass felt like a gunshot in the silent room. She checked the clock. It was 2:14 a.m. The rhythmic click-click-click of her digital recorder in her pocket provided the only steady beat in the room. She had to get Elizabeth out. She had to move before the house woke up and the glass jar they lived in shattered. A soft tap at the window made her jump, nearly dropping a bottle of saline. It was Kevin. He looked like a ghost in the moonlight, his lanky frame hunched over, his fingers stained with the black ink of a dozen dismantled printers. He signaled with a frantic wave of his hand. Sarah signaled back, a quick flash of her phone screen. They had rehearsed this in whispers for weeks. but the reality of the cold floor and the smell of medicine made it feel impossible. Kevin was her only tether to the world outside this estate, the only one who knew that the care Michael provided was a slow-motion burial. They began the transition, the heavy lifting of a body that felt more like a memory than a person. Elizabeth let out a long, trembling sigh, her eyes fluttering but never truly opening. Sarah leaned in close, whispering into her mother's ear, promising a world where the grass wasn't neon and the air didn't taste like chemicals. Kevin gripped the other side of the gurney, his leg bouncing with a restless, nervous energy. "Sorry," he mouthed as he bumped a metal tray, the clatter echoing like a mountain slide. Sorry. They reached the side exit, the heavy steel door groaning on its hinges. Just as the cool night air hit Sarah's face, a shadow detached itself from the wall. It was James Miller. He stood 6'4", a mountain of muscle and scarred skin, his neck thicker than his head. The rhythmic crack of his knuckles filled the small entryway, a sound like dry branches snapping in a storm. He didn't say a word. He simply stepped into the light of the security lamp, his eyes as blank as a shark's. "Move aside, James," Sarah said, her voice cracking but holding a sharp, desperate edge. She shifted her weight, the heavy medical textbook in her hand, a 1,000-page brick of anatomy, feeling like a weapon. James didn't move. He looked at Elizabeth's slumped form, then back at Sarah. "Boss said no one leaves, especially not the cargo." The word cargo snapped something inside Sarah. She didn't think. She lunged. As James reached out a massive hand to seize her shoulder, she swung the textbook with every ounce of terror and rage she possessed. The corner of the heavy binding caught him square in the temple with a sickening thud. James staggered, his eyes rolling back for a split second. It was the only window they had. "Go, Kevin, go!" Sarah screamed. She shoved the gurney toward the waiting SUV. But as Kevin scrambled to load it, Sarah saw the encrypted keycard dangling from James's belt. It was the silver ticket to the restricted wing, the piece of plastic that controlled the server room and the medical logs. She reached down, her fingers brushing the rough fabric of his trousers, and yanked the card free. The plastic bit into her palm, a cold, hard promise. "I've got the book. Get her out of here," Kevin shouted, slamming the trunk. He peeled out, the gravel spraying like buckshot against the side of the house. Sarah stood alone in the driveway, the key card clutched in her hand, watching the red taillights vanish into the Greenwich fog. She wasn't out yet. She was still inside the belly of the beast. Subverted. Sarah retreated into the infirmary, her mind racing. She had the key card, but she needed to know exactly what Robert Wilson, the specialized nurse Michael had hired, was actually doing to Elizabeth. She crept toward Wilson's private office at the back of the wing. The room was a shrine to sterile obsession. Rows of hand sanitizer, 3 different sinks, and a desk so clean it looked like it had never been used. She sat at his computer, her fingers hovering over the keys. She had spent months watching him, learning his patterns, his clinical jargon, and his obsessive-eyed focus on purity. She used the keycard to bypass the first lock, her heart soaring as the screen glowed blue. Access granted. She felt a rush of professional triumph. She was smart. She was prepared. She had spent years documenting Michael's lies, and now she was finally at the source. She searched for the medical credentials of Dr. Robert Wilson. The search results populated quickly. She found his license. It was impressive. Top of his class, years of experience in high-end geriatric care. She felt a wave of relief wash over her. Perhaps she had been wrong. Perhaps Michael, in his own twisted way, had actually hired the best for her mother. The tension in her shoulders began to melt. If Wilson was legitimate, then the medicine was real, and the poison was just a figment of her own trauma-induced paranoia. She leaned back in the chair, her breath coming easier. She had found the truth, and for the first time in a decade, the truth felt like a safety net. Then, she noticed a small red icon in the corner of the file, a tiny digitized stamp from the State Board of Pharmacy. She clicked it, expecting a routine certification. The screen flickered. A new document opened, dated 3 years ago. The face was the same, the hollowed eyes, the thin, nervous lips. But the name was different. Robert Vance. The report wasn't a commendation, it was a death warrant. Vance hadn't been a doctor. He was a pharmacist who had been caught in a massive insurance fraud scheme involving the distribution of tainted, diluted medications to cancer patients. 3 people had died because he had replaced their life-saving drugs with sugar water to line his pockets. He hadn't been hired to heal Elizabeth. He had been hired because he knew exactly how to make a person look like they were dying while keeping them just healthy enough to sign a check. The care wasn't a shield. It was the weapon. The specialized treatment Sarah had fought so hard to understand was a slow-motion execution. The realization hit her like a physical blow to the stomach. She wasn't just fighting Michael's greed. She was fighting a professional killer who was currently holding the syringe to her mother's vein. The room felt like it was shrinking, the smell of bleach suddenly cloying and poisonous. She hadn't found a savior. She had found the man who was paid to make sure her mother never woke up. Her legs felt like lead as she realized she had left her mother's life in the hands of a man who traded in shadows and diluted hope. The heavy thud of the front door echoing through the house signaled Michael's return. Sarah scrambled out of the office, the stolen keycard burning a hole in her pocket. She made it back to the main house just as Michael entered the dining hall. He looked as though he had stepped out of a magazine. His suit perfectly pressed, his silver hair catching the light of the chandelier. He didn't look like a man who had just ordered a slow murder. He looked like a man who was about to enjoy a very expensive glass of scotch. "Sarah," he said, his voice a low, melodic purr that made the hair on her arms stand up. He didn't look at her. He looked at his watch, then straightened his tie exactly 3 times. "You're up late? I trust the excitement in the driveway is settled?" "James tripped," Sarah said, her voice flat, mimicking his clinical tone. She kept her hand in her pocket, her thumb tracing the edge of the recorder. Click, click, click. Michael smiled, but his eyes remained as cold as a winter morning in the Atlantic. Unfortunate. He's usually so sure-footed. But no matter. Plans have shifted, Sarah. The flight to Switzerland, the one for the Leadership Academy you were so reluctant to join, has been moved up. You leave at 8 a.m. tomorrow. The air left the room. Tomorrow? That's 18 hours from now. Time waits for no one, especially not for a young woman with such active imagination. Michael said, leaning in. He smelled of metallic citrus and old money. The academy will provide the structure you clearly lack. And don't worry about your mother. Dr. Wilson has assured me her new regimen is quite effective. She won't even know you're gone. He was deporting her. He was removing the only person who looked at the medicine bottles, the only one who checked the oxygen levels. Sarah felt the cage door swinging shut. She had 18 hours to find the evidence, expose the pharmacist, and break her mother out of a house that had become a fortress. "I'm not going," she said, her voice a whisper of defiance. Michael's smile didn't falter. but his voice dropped an octave, becoming a hushed, intimate ultimatum. "Oh, Sarah, we both know that isn't true. You'll go because if you don't, your mother's delicate constitution might not survive the stress of a domestic dispute. Let's not be difficult. It's making the air in here quite heavy, don't you think?" He turned and walked away, his footsteps silent on the thick Persian rug. Sarah stood in the center of the room, the weight of the 18-hour countdown pressing against her chest like a physical hand. She waited until his shadow vanished, then pulled out her digital recorder. She needed a confession. She needed him to say the words out loud. She caught up to him in the library, where the scent of rotting paper and old glue was thick enough to choke on. Michael was pouring a drink, the amber liquid swirling in the crystal glass. "Michael, let's talk about the offshore accounts," she said, stepping into the room. She had the recorder tucked into her sleeve, the microphone pointed directly at him. "The ones you used to drain Mom's trust. I saw the ledger. I know about the transfers to the West End." Michael stopped pouring. He didn't turn around. The silence in the library was absolute, save for the rhythmic thud, thud, thud of the waves against the cliffs outside. "You've been busy," he said softly. He turned, and for a second, Sarah thought she saw a flicker of genuine amusement in his eyes. He walked toward her, his movements slow and hypnotic. "You think a little plastic toy is going to save you?" Before she could react, his hand shot out, catching her wrist in a grip that felt like a steel vise. He didn't squeeze hard enough to break the bone, but he held her with a terrifying, effortless strength. He reached into her sleeve and pulled out the recorder. "This?" he asked, holding it up to the light. He looked at it with the same disdain he might show a piece of trash. He dropped it on the hardwood floor and brought his heel down. The sound of plastic shattering was loud as a gunshot. "Amateur, Sarah. You're playing a game where the rules were written before you were born." He let go of her wrist and stepped back, straightening his tie for the third time. "Get some sleep. You have a long flight ahead of you." Sarah retreated, her heart hammering against her ribs. She didn't go to her room. Instead, she headed for the infirmary wing, her mind a whirlwind of desperation. She had to see her mother. She had to know if she was still there. But when she reached the heavy mahogany door of Elizabeth's bedroom, she found the handle wouldn't budge. It wasn't just stuck, it was locked from the outside. A heavy, industrial bolt had been installed, the metal cold and unyielding against her palm. "Mom?" she whispered, pressing her ear to the wood. Silence. Not even the sound of the oxygen concentrator. A cold dread washed over her. She looked down the hallway and realized something else was missing. Buddy, the golden retriever who usually slept at the foot of Elizabeth's bed, was nowhere to be seen. The house felt hollow, stripped of its life, leaving only the sterile hum of the security system. She had to get to the basement. The home's main server was there, the brain of the estate that recorded every door opening, every camera feed, and every medical log. If she could download those files, she could prove the lockdown, prove the pharmacist's fraud, and prove Michael's intent. The basement was a hostile world of exposed concrete and low-hanging pipes. The roar of the industrial cooling fans was so loud it made her teeth ache. She moved through the shadows of the server racks, the blinking green lights of the machines looking like the eyes of 1,000 tiny predators. A shadow moved at the end of the row. Sarah froze. The scent of lavender and surgical soap drifted through the air. It was Robert Wilson. He was holding a tray, and on that tray sat a single gleaming syringe filled with a pale amber liquid. He wasn't looking for a patient. He was looking for her. "Sarah," he called out, his voice a flat, terrifying drone that cut through the roar of the fans. "You're looking a bit peaked, a bit agitated. Michael is worried about your health. He thinks you need a little something to help you rest for your trip." He began to count the ceiling tiles out loud. 1, 2, 3. Sarah ducked behind a rack of humming processors. Her fingertips were blue from the cold, her breath coming in short, visible puffs. She could hear the click, click, click of her own teeth chattering. She had to move. She couldn't let him get close. Wilson rounded the corner, his eyes scanning the floor. 4, 5, 6. Sarah lunged for the service elevator, a cramped metal box barely wide enough for a person. She hit the button, the motor groaning as the doors began to slide shut. Wilson's hand reached through the gap, the needle glinting in the strobe-like light of a flickering fluorescent bulb. Sarah shoved her bag into the gap, the heavy leather stopping the doors from reopening. The elevator lurched upward, leaving Wilson standing in the dark, his counting fading into the roar of the fans. She spilled out into the pantry on the main floor, her lungs burning. She slammed the door and turned the manual lock, sinking to the floor among the floor-to-ceiling shelves of canned goods. The room smelled of metallic preservatives and dust. She pulled out her laptop and the stolen keycard. Her hands were shaking so hard she could barely plug the card reader in. "Come on, Kevin," she whispered, her eyes fixed on the screen. "Tell me you found something." The data from the keycard began to populate the screen. It was a mess of encrypted strings and clinical codes. But as the software began to peel back the layers, Sarah saw the truth. The medical logs weren't just records of treatment. They were a schedule of incapacitation. Every time Michael had a board meeting or a major financial transfer, Elizabeth's dosage was spiked. But it was the chemical analysis of the restorative vials that made Sarah's blood run cold. The vials didn't contain medicine. They didn't even contain the diluted drugs Wilson was known for. They were placebos, saline solution mixed with a mild sedative. Michael wasn't just keeping her sick. He was ensuring she stayed in a state of perpetual, foggy compliance, while her body slowly withered from lack of actual care. He didn't want her dead yet. He wanted her to be a living ghost, a signature on a page that didn't know what it was signing. She had the final proof: the medical tampering, the financial theft, the illegal lockdown. But the clock was ticking. The Bon Voyage party was starting in the ballroom, and the house was filling with the town's elite. People who saw Michael Davis as a pillar of the community, a man of wealth and taste. Sarah changed into a black silk dress, her fingers fumbling with the zipper. She hid her phone and a small transmitter in the folds of her skirt. She had to move through the party, find Kevin's signal, and get the decrypted ledger. The ballroom was a whirlwind of spinning chandeliers and overlapping echoes. The air was thick with expensive perfume and the clink of champagne glasses. Sarah felt like a specimen in a glass jar, every eye on her, every smile a potential trap. She saw Jennifer Scott across the room, draped in diamonds that clinked like 1,000 tiny bells. Jennifer was humming "Happy Birthday" as she scrubbed her hands with a wet wipe, her eyes darting around the room for the next piece of gossip. "Sarah, darling," Jennifer chirped, her laughter a high-pitched, brittle sound. "You look like you're ready for an adventure." "Switzerland, how divine. It's a long trip," Sarah said, her eyes scanning the crowd. She saw a flicker of movement by the buffet table. It was Kevin, dressed in a waiter's uniform that was 2 sizes too big for him. He caught her eye and gave a subtle nod toward the library. Sarah broke away from Jennifer and navigated the crowd, her heart a frantic percussion against her ribs. She slipped into the library, the heavy mahogany doors muffling the roar of the party. The room was dark, the only light coming from the moon reflecting off the Atlantic waves outside. "I have it," Kevin whispered, stepping out from behind a row of encyclopedias. He handed her a small silver thumb drive. "The ledger is clean. He's been moving millions out of the venture firm to cover gambling debts in Macau. He's not just stealing from your mom, Sarah. He's stealing from everyone in that ballroom." "Thank you, Kevin," Sarah said, her voice thick with emotion. She touched his arm, the first human contact she'd had in days that didn't feel like a threat. "Go," Kevin said, his leg bouncing. "I've got the car waiting by the service entrance. We can get your mom and be in the city by midnight." Sarah turned to leave, but the library doors swung open before she could reach them. Michael stood there, his silhouette framed by the light of the hallway. He didn't look angry. He looked disappointed. "Kevin, I think your shift is over," Michael said, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. Two security guards stepped into the room and seized Kevin by the arms. He didn't fight. He just looked at Sarah with wide, terrified eyes. "Sorry," he mouthed. "I'm so sorry." Michael walked into the room and shut the doors. He didn't look at Kevin as the guards dragged him out. He looked only at Sarah. He walked to the desk and picked up a smartphone. "You've been very clever, Sarah," Michael said, his voice syrupy and hypnotic. "But you've forgotten one thing. I control the air in this house, literally." He turned the screen toward her. It showed a live feed of Elizabeth's room. The oxygen concentrator was humming, a small green light glowing on the side. Michael's thumb hovered over a red button on the screen. "This is a remote kill switch," Michael said, his eyes locking onto hers. "One tap and the oxygen stops. Your mother is currently sedated. She won't wake up. She'll just stop breathing. It'll look like a natural complication of her delicate condition." Sarah felt the world tilt. The smell of rotting paper in the library seemed to intensify, filling her lungs with dust. "You wouldn't." "I would," Michael said, his voice a hushed, intimate ultimatum. "I've built a life here, Sarah. I won't let a disgruntled child tear it down. Now, you're going to sit at that desk, and you're going to sign the emancipation papers and the non-disclosure agreement. And then you're going to get on that plane." Subverted, Sarah looked at the papers on the desk. They were crisp, cream-colored, and smelled of expensive ink. She looked at Michael, then back at the screen showing her mother's rhythmic, shallow breathing. She had the thumb drive in her pocket. She had the evidence of his gambling, his theft, his fraud. She could win. She could destroy him right now. But the thumb on the red button was steady. Michael wasn't bluffing. He was a man who had replaced his own soul with a numbered system of silk shirts. Sarah picked up the pen. It was a heavy, gold-plated fountain pen that felt like a lead weight in her hand. She thought about the logic of it. If she signed, she bought time. She could get him to relax, wait for the guards to move Kevin, and then find a way to disable the switch. It was the smart play. It was the only way to ensure Elizabeth's heart kept beating for the next 10 minutes. She signed her name in a jagged, trembling script. "There," she whispered, shoving the papers toward him. "It's done. Now leave her alone." Michael picked up the papers and examined the signature with a clinical eye. He smiled, a warm, fatherly expression that didn't reach his predatory eyes. "Good girl, Sarah. I knew you'd see reason. You've saved your mother's life today. Why don't you go to the kitchen and get some water? You look quite pale." "I'll handle the filing," Sarah turned toward the door, her mind already counting the steps to the service elevator. 1, 2, 3. She felt a wave of relief wash over her. She had traded her freedom for her mother's life, but she still had the drive. She still had a chance. The crisis was over, for now. She stopped at the threshold. Something about Michael's posture. Too rigid, too still. She turned back. He wasn't filing the papers. He was looking at his phone, his thumb moving across a different sequence of buttons. A cold prickle danced across Sarah's skin. "What are you doing?" she asked, her voice a sharp blade in the silent room. Michael didn't look up. "I'm updating the security protocols, Sarah. Now that you've signed these, you're no longer a member of this household. Your key card, the one you stole from James, it's been revoked, along with your access to the guest house and the infirmary." The truth hit her like a physical blow. By signing the emancipation papers, she hadn't just given up her inheritance. She had legally severed her right to make medical decisions for her mother. She had handed Michael the legal authority to bar her from the property, to keep her away from Elizabeth, and to move her mother to an undisclosed care facility where Sarah would never find her. The papers weren't a peace treaty. They were her own eviction notice. "You can't do that," Sarah gasped, lunging for the desk. Michael stepped back, his face a mask of cold indifference. "I just did. The guards are waiting in the hallway to escort you to the airport. If you try to return, you'll be arrested for trespassing. And as for your mother, well, she's in Dr. Wilson's very capable hands now. You've made your choice, Sarah. You chose to sign." The realization of her own catastrophic mistake made her knees weak. She had tried to be smart, tried to negotiate with a monster, and in doing so, she had handed him the very leash he needed to drag her mother into the shadows forever. She was worse off than before. She wasn't just a daughter fighting for her mother. She was now a legal stranger with no right to even enter the room. "But wait," Michael said, a cruel smirk playing on his lips. "There's one more thing. Before you go, I think you should see this." He pulled a file from the desk drawer, a thick manila folder filled with grainy photographs and bank statements. He spread them out like a winning hand of cards. "This is your biological father, Thomas," Michael said, pointing to a photo of a man with frayed cuffs and a perpetual layer of sweat on his lip. "He's a desperate man, Sarah. A gambling man. Just like me. But unlike me, he wasn't smart enough to hide it." Sarah looked at the documents. They showed a series of transfers from the venture firm, the same ones Kevin had found. But these weren't in Michael's name. They were signed by Thomas Anderson. "I've framed him," Michael whispered, his voice a low, gravelly rasp. "Every cent I took, I made it look like it went through his accounts. If you speak a word about the ledger, if you show that drive to anyone, I'll send the FBI to his door. He'll spend the rest of his life in a federal cage. So, tell me, Sarah, who do you want to save today? Your mother, who's already halfway to the grave? Or your father, who still has a few years of misery left?" Sarah stood in the center of the library, the weight of the double betrayal crushing the air from her lungs. She was paralyzed. Every move she had made to find the truth had only woven the net tighter. She had lost her mother's care, her own legal standing, and now she was being forced to choose which parent to destroy. Michael checked his watch and straightened his tie for the third time. The countdown was over. "It's time for your speech, Sarah. The guests are waiting. Don't forget to smile. People are watching." He led her out of the library and toward the ballroom stage. The lights were blinding, the heat from the crowd rising like a physical wall. Sarah stood behind the microphone, the "Happy Birthday" humming of Jennifer Scott echoing in the rafters. She looked out at the sea of faces, the wealthy, the powerful, the people who owned the world, and she saw them for what they were. A collection of glass jars, all of them waiting to be shattered. She felt the garbage chute opening over her head. The limousine was waiting outside. The plane was fueled. But as she looked down at her hands, she felt the cold weight of the transmitter in her skirt. She thought about the server room, the industrial cooling fans, and the localized EMP she had rigged using the nurse's medical equipment. A desperate, last-ditch plan she had constructed in the pantry. She didn't start the speech. Instead, she reached into the folds of her dress and pressed the trigger. The world went black. A sudden, violent crackle of electricity ripped through the ballroom. The chandeliers flickered and died, the spinning gold leaf plunging into a terrifying, absolute darkness. The high-frequency security hum that had vibrated through the floorboards for years suddenly stopped, leaving a silence so heavy it felt like a physical weight. The electronic locks on every door in the house clicked open as the smart grid collapsed. "What is this?" Michael's voice boomed in the dark, stripped of its melodic control. Sarah didn't answer. She used the darkness to move. She knew the layout of the house better than anyone. Every groan of the floorboards, every scent of cedar. She sprinted toward the service elevator, her heart a hammer against her ribs. The backup power kicked in, but not for the lights. It kicked in for the broadcast. Every guest's smartphone in the room suddenly buzzed. A video began to play, projected onto the massive digital screens that usually showed Michael's philanthropic achievements. It wasn't a Leadership Academy video. It was the footage from the hidden camera in the infirmary. The footage of Robert Wilson counting ceiling tiles while he injected Elizabeth with saline. It was the audio of Michael threatening to cut off the oxygen. It was the ledger, the names, the dates, and the systematic theft of a dying woman's life. Sarah stood on the balcony, watching the chaos below. The crowd was no longer smiling. They were staring at their phones, their faces illuminated by the blue light of the betrayal. The front doors of the estate burst open. But it wasn't the local police who entered. It was a team of men in dark windbreakers with FBI emblazoned in yellow across their backs. Leading them was Richard Taylor, the man Michael had thought was his loyal legal counsel. He didn't look like a lawyer now. He looked like a hunter. He walked straight to Michael, who was standing frozen in the center of the ballroom, his white silk shirt stained with the sweat of a man who had finally lost control. "Michael Davis," Richard said, his voice like polished gravel. "You're under arrest for wire fraud, medical tampering, and embezzlement. And before you ask, yes, we have the ledger. And no, your frame job on Thomas Anderson didn't hold up to forensic analysis." Sarah watched from the shadows as the handcuffs clicked shut around Michael's wrists. The man who had rotated 47 identical shirts was led out onto the neon green lawn. His head bowed, his power stripped away in a single, flickering moment. The sun began to rise over the Atlantic, a thin line of gold breaking through the gray horizon. Sarah sat by her mother's bedside in the quiet of the guest house. The industrial bleach smell was gone, replaced by the scent of salt air and the rhythmic, natural sound of the waves. Actual doctors, not pharmacists with criminal records, were adjusting the monitors. Elizabeth's eyes fluttered open. For the first time in years, they weren't foggy with sedatives. They were clear, a deep, resonant blue that matched the morning sky. She reached out a trembling hand and touched Sarah's cheek. "You stayed," Elizabeth whispered, her voice a fragile but real sound. "I stayed," Sarah said, her throat tightening. She looked down at her hands. They were no longer trembling. They were steady. The hands of a woman who had dismantled a gilded prison and built a fortress of truth in its place. She walked out onto the balcony, the biting city air now feeling like a benediction. The Greenwich estate was no longer a cage. It was just a house. And as the sun rose higher, casting long shadows across the manicured lawn, Sarah Johnson realized she was no longer a fugitive or a victim. She was the head of the Johnson estate, the protector of her family's legacy. And for the first time in her life, she didn't need a digital recorder to know that she was finally, undeniably, free.